Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Natalie Jaresko, who is the Managing Director of Turnaround and Restructuring Strategy for EY Parthenon, also former Finance Minister of Ukraine between 2014 2016. Minister Jaresko, nice to see you.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's start. We've just seen, President Vladimir Zelensky was at the G7. How effective was that trip for Ukraine?
So President Zelensky was at the G7. He just came from a very important Arab League meeting, and he has been traveling, continuing to both tell the story of what exactly is happening in Ukraine, but also building support broadly. That G7 meeting was important, but the G7 is very supportive of Ukraine, in particular financially, militarily. I think the sideline meetings with the leader of India, with leaders of South Korea, Indonesia, and others were also incredibly important because the global South is so important to maintaining a global support for Ukraine in this horrific war.
I want to talk about the finance picture. I believe you're in Kyiv right now. Am I correct? And you negotiated a very transformative IMF package for Ukraine back in, I guess you'd say the first war. I don't know how you'd refer to it in terms of the incursion, but what is it that Ukraine needs right now in terms of, obviously, besides the war to stop, what can be done at the moment while there's still fighting going on?
So what you hear often is weapons, 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 because ending the war is really the absolute number one objective. But that said, this is also very much a war of attrition. Putin and the Kremlin and Russia have very clearly identified that they can go much longer than Ukraine can because of the damage that they're doing to the infrastructure of the country. More than 90% of bombings happen to civilian infrastructure. So that's energy and roads and hospitals and schools. And that affects the tax base, as you can well imagine. So what we saw last year in 2022, when this full-scale invasion occurred, February 24th, after, as you said, the initial invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, what we saw was a decline of some 30% of GDP. And that means that Ukraine needs financial support today, financial support for a budget deficit. And the G7 and partners have come in for a substantial amount of support for that budget. And that budget deficit, covering it, is important because you want the government to be able to continue to govern, pay civil servants, make sure that teachers are working, doctors are working, and everyone is getting, their salaries are minimal, but they're getting paid. It also includes pensions for the elderly who have no other options, and very small subsidies for the internally displaced people, of which there are approximately 4 million in Ukraine who've lost their homes as a result of this war. So that $3 billion per month budget deficit, about $36 billion a year, is being covered in the first instance by the G7, by Western governments who are supportive, democratic governments who are supportive. But as I sit here today in Kyiv, there's also a new IMF program. Ukraine just recently agreed to a new IMF program. And I think that IMF program is really important. The first review of that is going on today in Vienna. And I think why it's important is because the IMF provides confidence to everyone that the economic policies, the monetary policy of the central bank are within a certain reasonable set of parameters. And it gives the donors confidence that, in fact, the economy is being managed well. And so when the IMF entered into this new program with Ukraine, it was a seal of good housekeeping on economic and financial and monetary policy.
It's interesting because I think of the IMF, to your point, as being almost the force that imposes discipline on an economy, to get it out of bad straits. It seems like the role would be more limited during a wartime economy, would it not? Because, how much discipline can one be enforcing during such a chaotic period?
Indeed, it is rare to have a program like this in the midst of war, but it gives you a sense of Ukraine's commitment to the reforms. The kinds of things that the IMF is making sure of right now is that Ukraine operates within a certain budget deficit that is financed for the most part, that they're not, in essence, printing money, which would cause hyperinflation. If you had if you were spending without any limits and printing money, didn't have a source of financing that deficit, it would be even worse than what this war is already for Ukrainian people. Hyperinflation, I lived through it in 1994, is just it's very, very difficult for average people. So they're looking at tax policy, revenue collection, the monetary policy of the central bank, making sure, as I said, that they're within a certain range of reasonableness to keep the economy on track. In addition to that, the IMF works on all of the anti-corruption policies and works on ensuring that the anti-corruption institutions that were set up back under our program back in 2015-16 are fully functioning well, apolitically. And so it has a second element to the program that's quite important above and beyond the economics and the monetary.
So, Minister Jaresko, what are you doing in Kyiv right now?
I'm here to speak at the Kyiv Security Forum, and I'm specifically going to be talking about economic security. Because, as I mentioned, this is, in essence, a war of attrition. And the economic security is what enables the government to continue the fight. So the weapons are important, of course, and military defeat is important, but existing, continuing to function, continuing to provide for the most basic needs of the people is critical. And this year, in a World Bank damage assessment that was issued on the anniversary of the full-scale invasion in February, and $14 billion, $14.1 billion was identified as the needs for recovery today, now, this year. In other words, we're not going to wait for a big reconstruction to happen until after all the hostilities have ceased. There are things that need to be done today. One, when you liberate towns after they've been occupied, you have to put back into place roads and bridges and hospitals, things that have been destroyed. And second, this bombing campaign that I described to you, where over 90% is hitting civilian infrastructure, needs to be dealt with. So all winter, there's been work going on to reestablish energy supply, for example, whether it's heating or electricity. And the Ukrainians have done such a good job in recovering that, in fact, today, Ukraine is exporting electricity to the European Union again. So a budget of about $14 billion to do urgent repair today, again, to ensure that things are livable. So I'll be talking about economic security and the importance of planning for the future, planning for that bigger reconstruction and how we might finance that bigger reconstruction.
I want to ask, you were finance minister during not just wartime period, but also a very difficult period in the economy for Ukraine. Any advice, any lessons that you gleaned from that you would share, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine right now? It sounds like everything that can happen is happening. Is there anything advice you would give from the experience you had?
The one thing I always say is in times of crisis, you have to do the maximum because there's a political will to do so. So I would use this time of crisis to do the maximum in terms of reform that's possible during a wartime, whether it's planning for a tax reform, whether it's planning for a customs reform, but all the things that we know still need to be worked upon. I would not waste a moment, and I'm certain that the government is focusing on that. I think that one of the differences between today and 2015, when I was minister, is the incredible level of support globally that's being provided. And so I think that is to the benefit right now of the situation. Of course, the war is so much worse than it was when I was minister, but there is a great deal more support coming in. So I think planning ahead, right now, planning ahead for that reconstruction is got to take a lot of brains, a lot of tools. It's got to take a lot of imagination, vision. And I think to some extent, you can't start too early in that planning. So I would use this time for planning for the next stage and use the crisis to the maximum extent to push forward with all the things that need to happen.
Now, one other question, which is the question of China. Does it matter if China steps up to the table and offers aid itself?
Well, I think it's really up to the Ukrainian government to make that determination. Right now, I think China is not offering aid, and so I don't know that that's a question that's on the table. They're offering negotiations. They're offering support in identifying peace. And President Zelensky has spoken with the Chinese president. There was recently a visit of an envoy here, so those discussions are ongoing. But I don't know that there's any offer on the table to be discussed.
Okay. Anything else you would like to add, especially to people? There's this tendency we're into year 2. We don't know how long. As you said, it's a war of attrition, which can be a long time. There must be some concerns about the momentum being lost.
So as I sit here, what I would tell everyone is how amazingly resilient this society is. There are museum openings, exhibit openings happening today. There are small businesses being run. There are children in school here. People are trying to live normal lives. You can't fly into Ukraine. I took a train in, and the train was filled with people coming home, refugees coming back, families coming back. And so what I would ask is for everyone to understand that although it is now in the second year from our perspective from this full-scale incursion, this is year 10, in essence, for Ukrainians. And yet they're resilient and defiant and fighting. And so they need our support. I also think we should look at this as somewhat of an opportunity to be part of what I think is going to be a very exciting reconstruction. I know it's hard to say that while the war is going on, but if you think about how the Ukrainians have described their vision of the reconstruction, it's a green reconstruction. It is technological leapfrogging in terms of digital government, in terms of the use of technology in the economy. Ukraine is a grain provider, a food security provider for the world, so it's restoring that. It's also about EU accession, meaning adopting the standards and the rules of the European Union as they rebuild. So this is going to be what I think is going to be an exciting opportunity. Investors need to start getting ready. This isn't going to be only yours and my taxpayer dollars going to this, although there'll be a public element of funding. I think a big part of this needs to be the private sector to bring technology and innovation. And I think that can be a very exciting platform upon which to build a government that's inviting you to bring the best of the best to bear, whether it's urban design or architecture, whether it's green steel, or whether it's developing food and food processing. It's an opportunity for something that I think is going to be one of the largest reconstruction in our lifetime. And so I think as we look at this, we need to look not only at the pain and the suffering and the horrors of war, which we need to remind ourselves constantly have no place in this century, but at the same time understand that this is a war that defines the world. It defines the world in which we're going to live. And that means whether we live with a rule of law and order society, or whether we live in a society where brute force is what dictates. So from an economic standpoint, I'm talking to Forbes, from an economic standpoint, that system of rule of law and order is what enabled us to prosper. It's that system of peace post-World War II that enabled us to grow our markets globally. And this war is a war not only about Ukraine, but it's about that system. And so it's in our interest to maintain that system so we can maintain that growth and that economic opportunity, and then see Ukraine as a part of it.
Yep.
Not just forget and put it behind us, but actually make that an integral part of that growth.
No, excellent point. And I think, Japan certainly stands as an example when you talk about the post-war period. So thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. I think it's an important message, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much.